So if you've just joined us, good morning, and we're just about to start. We've got another couple of minutes, and I was just asking if you'd ever experienced a loss of smell or taste when you've had a heavy cold or something like that, and what that was like. And really, it's the intensity of the return of those senses that we're going to talk about today, really. So we've got just another minute. If you apart from Graham and Trees, if you'd like to put your name in the chat and say where you're viewing from, that's always very interesting for others. So this is all about today, all about the senses particularly. Okay, well it is just now past, so let's make a start. So good morning, I'm Nicholas de Mattos. I'm a student and a tutor in the School of Philosophy and Economic Science. And I'm going to talk to you today about Helen Keller. And let's put a picture of her. Helen Keller was born on June 27th, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama in the USA. She was one of 5 children born to Arthur Keller, a journalist and editor of the journal The North Alabamian. Theirs was a slave-owning family, Confederates, and it may have been this which gave her such a social conscience later in life. At 19 months old in 1882, Helen contracted a strange, unknown disease described by doctors at the time as an acute congestion of the stomach and brain. Nowadays, conjecture has it that it was meningitis or a fatal variant of influenza that was killing 97% of infants at around this time in America. Whatever it was, Helen was left both deaf and blind. She described her experience as a child up to the age of 7 as being like at sea in a dense fog. Now I'm going to do a little experiment. What I'm going to ask you to do is block your ears off, close your eyes, and then get up and, with your ears blocked and your eyes closed, walk around your chair and sit down again. All right, so I'm going to do that in real time. And if you didn't manage to do that at the same time as I did, I'm going to give you a chance to do that now. So getting up, blocking, closing your eyes, blocking ears, and walking around the chair with your ears blocked and your eyes closed, and then sitting down on it. Or if you haven't got a chair, then round in a circle. Now, if you're anything like me, you would have lost, well, you had a less of a sense of balance, much being like at sea. You might even have bumped into the chair or something else and had difficulty sitting back down in the chair, much like being at sea. And if, as she says, if Helen was able to see light at least, it must have seemed a bit like a dense fog. Now, the daughter of the family cook, Martha Washington, who was 2 years older, was particularly able to understand Helen's home signs, for Helen was desperate to communicate. By the age of 7, Helen had 60 recognizable signs by which she communicated her needs to her family. Naturally, her other senses were the more acute. For instance, she could tell who was approaching by the vibration, not the sound of their footsteps. During the 1880s, Charles Dickens toured America and wrote his American notes. In these, at one point, he describes the successful education of Laura Bridgman, a similarly deaf and blind woman. After Helen's mother had read this and inspired to do more for Helen, she sent her with her father to consult Julian Chisholm, an EENT specialist in Baltimore, for advice, and he, in turn, referred them to Alexander Bell of telephone fame, who was working with deaf children at this time. Bell advised them to contact the Perkins Institute for the Blind, where Bridgman had been educated, in South Boston. The principal of the school, Michael Anagnos, asked Anne Sullivan, an alumna of the school, who was visually impaired, to become Helen's teacher, and so started a 50-year partnership. The day of the arrival of Anne at Helen's house is described by Helen as my soul's birthday. Anne brought with her, as a present, a doll, and immediately began to teach Helen a finger spelling alphabet by spelling signs into her hand, a sign for each letter. And the first word she spelt was D-O-L-L, doll. Now, imagine learning not only an alphabet, but to read all at the same time. Helen struggled at first because she hadn't realized a very simple fact, that everything had a name, something which we take for granted. An early example of Helen's ability and parallel frustration was when, unable to comprehend that Anne was trying to teach her the word for mug, Helen smashed it, and not in a good way. As she said, all she was doing at that point was copying the movement of Anne's fingers in her hand without realizing what it signified. But Anne was patient and persistent, and Helen was very quick of apprehension. About a month later, there was a dramatic breakthrough. We walked down the path to the wellhouse. This is in Helen's autobiography. We walked down the path to the wellhouse, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelt into the other the word water, at first slowly and then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motion of the fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought. And somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew that the water meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it's true, but barriers that could in time be swept away. I left the wellhouse eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. Now, let's run through this quote and make some observations. She says, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle. So she was already in a highly attentive and appreciative state. That's one thing. When the water was flowing over her hand, it wasn't as though this had happened for the first time. She would have known about water and indeed every other kind of liquid. What was different about this occasion was the sudden realization of the association of the water with the letters, and the combination of the letters with a word being spelt into her hand. That's another thing. Notice her use of language, a consciousness of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought. This is not just poetic language. This is what she experienced and raises as many questions as it answers. She talks about her soul being awakened and set free. Suddenly, she had the means of expressing herself, not just her physical needs, but the whole world of language. and thrilled, she pestered Anne for the names of everything she encountered in her everyday life. Each name, she says, gave birth to a new thought. Why? Because suddenly she was able to describe the object, say how it affected her. In fact, it unlocked for her a journey of discovery, as she implies in the last line of this quote. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. Gradually, her world opened up. She could appreciate music by feeling the beat, and later by feeling the vibrations of live music from a quartet by means of a resonant tabletop. She also indulged her love of animals through touch. Let me show you. Now, with Anne accompanying her, she attended the Perkins Institute and other schools as she grew up. Helen's academic ability became recognized, and she entered in 1900 Radcliffe College, Harvard, and became the first deaf-blind person to attain a BA degree. She tried hard to learn to speak and to continue to improve her speech so that she could deliver lectures and enable audiences to understand her better. But in the end, she had to rely on Anne and later Polly to interpret her words. She learned to feel people's speech by feeling with one hand their lips and throats, imagine that, and to read Braille. As always, she continued to receive communication by finger spelling in her hand. Anne remained Helen's companion and helpmeet even after Anne married John Macy in 1906. Anne and her husband continued to support Helen in everything she did, and she did a lot. She used the fame resulting from her triumph over her apparent disabilities to become an activist for a variety of social causes: women's rights, action against racial prejudice, against the imbalance between rich and poor, and for pacifism. She was inspired by the writings of Henry George. Now, by a strange quirk of fate, one of her Swiss ancestors was the first teacher of the deaf in Zurich. She says of this, "There is no king who has not had a slave amongst his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king in his." Now, I recommend a short YouTube video summing up Helen Keller, and I'll put the link in chat. In it, she expresses her one final regret. I'm just putting this link in chat. And that was that she hadn't learned to speak properly. Anyway, it's a very revealing video, and I recommend it. So, what's the significance of Helen Keller for us today? Well, if you're looking, see beauty in color and form. If you're listening, hear beauty in sound. Like Helen, the fragrance of the honeysuckle in the quote and the coolness of the water on her hand was intense. So how do we achieve that intensity of perception? Well, it must be by attention, because that's what Helen was giving in the quote. When we lose a sense, if we have a heavy cold, as I was saying before the talk, hopefully the senses return, those senses are intense, sense of smell and the sense of taste, and we're very grateful for it. And also, let's appreciate language. Maybe, like the senses, it's a gateway to the soul. So if you've enjoyed this talk, thanks very much for listening, and like it and share it, and watch this space for another Philosophy Live talk next week. Best wishes. Bye.